The Soldier Bear, World War II. A new Polish army was setting up in the Middle East in 1942 under British command when one of the soldiers noticed a bear cub presented to them by an Iranian boy. The bear had been made an orphan after its mother had been shot by hunters. The soldiers purchased the cub, and it was taken under care by a civilian refugee in the camp. In August, the bear was donated to the 2nd Transport Company, or what would become known as the 22nd Artillery Supply Company of the Polish II Corps, and given the name Wojtek by the soldiers, and soon he would become a morale-boosting mascot for the troops. The soldiers fed him milk from a vodka bottle, fruit, honey, and the odd beer as a reward. Wojtek was also fond of cigarettes, which he would smoke and eat, and liked to wrestle the men, and could salute on command. When the Polish army were about to leave Egypt to enter Italy in 1943, there was a problem with Wojtek's status as an animal, and he would not be allowed to accompany the soldiers in the fighting. To get around this, the bear was officially drafted into the Polish army as a private and given his own paybook and serial number. During the Battle of Monte Cassino, Wojtek supported the artillerymen by carrying crates of ammunition to the men. One of his carers, Henryk Zakarowicz, had to leave the bear alone for the day to spot targets. Wojtek was chained near the soldiers firing artillery and started copying what the men were doing, picking up the crates and carrying them near to the cannons. After the battle, the 22nd Artillery Supply Company made their badge a depiction of a bear holding a shell. When the war ended in May 1945, Wojtek and the 22nd were transported to Berwickshire, Scotland, and were stationed at Winfield Camp. Many of the soldiers would have to say goodbye to Wojtek, as their service would take them to other parts of the world. Following demobilization in 1947, Wojtek would live in Edinburgh Zoo, where he became popular with the locals, visited by journalists and the Polish ex-servicemen who fought with him. He would pass away in 1963 at the age of 21.
The Japanese army versus an army of crocodiles. Battle of Ramree Island. Strange stories of World War II. The Asian saltwater crocodile is a marvel of evolution. With its prehistoric form so effective, it hasn't changed significantly in millions of years. It is the largest reptile on the planet, in some cases growing up to 23 feet in length and weighing around a massive 2,200 pounds. As an apex predator, with its armor-like thick skin and powerful bite, it makes for a most formidable opponent. It is at the top of its food chain and will fight and devour any animal that enters its territory, including monkeys, birds, turtles, and even sharks. And of all the crocodile species, the saltwater variety has the strongest tendencies to treat humans as prey. They almost seem to regard us as a tasty snack that's to be savored and enjoyed. The saltwater crocodile is an opportunistic predator, waiting for food to come its way rather than going hunting for it. Any animal within a salty's range on the water's edge is likely seen as food. Humans who find themselves in this dangerous predicament can end up being the predator's next tasty treat. In contrast to this ferocious crocodile, the average Japanese imperial soldier of World War II was around 5 feet 3.5 inches tall and weighed around 120 pounds. He was fanatically dedicated to the emperor, focused and taught that surrender was not an option. He could live on a handful of rice a day, supplemented with what else could be foraged in the surrounding jungle. This could be snakes, rats, or even large spiders. He was normally armed with an Arisaka bolt-action rifle, as well as a 20-inch sword bayonet, both of which were used to devastating effect, with numerous countries falling to the Japanese Empire at the start of World War II. Between 1941 and 1943, the Japanese soldier was regarded as being near invincible, but soon the Allies' high numbers and better quality equipment began to bring down their fearsome reputation. And with all the chaos and intensity of World War II, it was inevitable that in the Pacific Theater, that troops on both sides would come into contact with vicious saltwater crocodiles with fatal consequences. Such an attack would happen on the island of Ramree, off what was then Burma. In January 1945, the British Army launched Operation Matador in an attempt to recapture several Japanese-held islands and establish air bases there. The Allied attack on Ramree began with a naval bombardment by a task force headed by the British battleship HMS Queen Elizabeth, which could fire 2,000-pound shells up to a distance of 30 miles. This barrage was quickly followed by RAF P-47 Thunderbolts, which strafed the beach ahead of the invasion force. Then the Japanese garrisons were mercilessly bombed by B-24 Liberator heavy bombers. Within hours, the Allies exerted complete control of the skies across the whole island, as Grumman F-6F Hellcat naval fighters from the carrier HMS Amir maintained air superiority. Then the Allies' amphibious landing began. Troops made their way through a coastal minefield, landing large numbers of Indian soldiers who were unopposed as they came ashore. But as they moved inland, the fighting began, quickly intensifying as the Japanese forces held out against their advance. 2 weeks later, the island's main town was under attack by Allied troops, supported by tanks. Japanese resistance was now crumbling. The Japanese, totally overwhelmed and outclassed, had been forced to retreat to their fortified strongholds in the hills. The British forces began to flank them, and now the risk of being surrounded was ever growing for the Japanese forces. This already crumbling Japanese garrison had no choice but to abandon their position and retreat. The Japanese commander made the painful and shameful decision to take his 900 men on a 10-mile march through the mangrove swamps to the other side of the island in the hopes of joining up with the other few remaining Japanese forces. However, the swamp was full of venomous snakes, scorpions, and disease-carrying mosquitoes, and most importantly, it was home to thousands of vicious saltwater crocodiles. Even the locals were afraid to venture into the swamps for fear of falling victim to one of its many predators. Many of the Japanese soldiers were sick or wounded. They were the first to be picked off by the crocodiles as they fell behind the main group. The crocodiles would suddenly appear out of nowhere, dragging its startled victim beneath the water. Once its prey was drowned, the salty would begin its death roll, ripping the limbs from its prey in a frenzied state. When the splashing ceased, the water would go still and mix with the fresh blood of the latest victim to fall prey to the local apex predator. Over the next few days, the Japanese troops made slow progress through the muddy swamp with its thick patches of dense foliage and almost impenetrable mangrove trees. As the days went by, the troops faced fatigue, starvation, and dehydration, which took its toll on the survivors. More and more soldiers started to fall behind the main group, allowing the crocodiles, true to their nature, to opportunistically pick off any stragglers. The crocodiles had now taken to devouring their victims before the very eyes of the soldiers' comrades. Before long, a basque of these predators were attacking the soldiers, tearing them apart and eating them brazenly. One night, the crocodiles would boldly wander into the Japanese camp and snatch an exhausted soldier, dragging him screaming into the swamp. His cries would quickly stop as he was eaten alive. Before long, these highly territorial creatures were seemingly killing for the sheer pleasure of it. Though, being opportunistic predators, it's far more likely they were excited about the abundance of a new food source. Within a week, the days and nights were filled with screams and gunfire, as more soldiers were killed by the crocodiles. Eventually, what little remained of the group emerged from the swamp, decimated by the crocs. The Japanese soldiers that had made it out alive frantically attempted an evacuation back to mainland Japan. No one knows the exact number of those who were killed in the swamp, and it has been highly debated. It's thought that at least 500 men perished in the swamp, but the true figure will likely never be known. On February 17th, the Japanese carried out aerial bombing raids that sunk an Allied destroyer, providing a distraction so a small fleet of rescue craft could evacuate the remaining survivors off the island. By February 22nd, the Japanese resistance on Ramree Island came to an end. Ironically, due to unregulated hunting on Ramree in the 1960s, the saltwater crocodile colony is now near extinct there, with only a handful lurking in the mangrove swamp.
The Great Emu War. In Australia in 1932, a strange war would see a conflict between humans and emus. Following the First World War, Australian and British veterans were given plots of land by the government so they could become farmers. These farmers were struggling to grow their crops in the difficult conditions, and the Great Depression had caused wheat prices to fall. From 1922, emus, the indigenous soft-feathered birds that are flightless, were a protected species, but they had become classed as vermin when 20,000 of the birds ate crops across Western Australia. The ex-soldiers turned farmers requested aid from the Australian military, asking the Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce, for machine guns and ammunition. Major G.P.W. Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery led 2 soldiers armed with Lewis light machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. They confidently believed it would be easy to take down the masses of emus at point-blank range with such a weapon. The war was postponed to the 2nd of November because of heavy rainfall. They traveled to the district of Campion, where they sighted around 50 emus and opened fire. However, the speed and ability to scatter into small groups made the emus able to dodge the fire and move out of range. Most got away, and only a handful were killed. 2 days later, they spotted 1,000 emus and planned to ambush the birds. They again scattered and dodged the fire, even at close range, and only 10 emus were killed, and one of the Lewis guns jammed. One of the soldiers said, "The emus have proved that they are not so stupid as they are usually considered to be. Each mob has its leader, always an enormous black plume bird standing fully 6 feet high, who keeps watch while his fellows busy themselves with the wheat. At the first suspicious sign, he gives the signal, and dozens of heads stretch up out of the crop. A few birds will take fright, starting a headlong stampede for the scrub, the leader always remaining until his followers have reached safety." The next tactic was to mount one of the Lewis guns on a truck. This failed too because the ride was bumpy and the emus were too fast, making accuracy impossible. The idea came to an end when a lone emu got caught in the steering wheel. On November 8th, after the negative media coverage at the humorous failure to cull the emus and discussion in the Australian House of Representatives, the group withdrew. They had used up 2,500 rounds of ammunition and killed just 200 emus. Major G.P.W. Meredith said in retrospect, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." A second attempt on the 12th of November was made after more emu attacks on crops. It was more successful, claiming 986 kills using 9,860 rounds at a rate of 10 rounds per confirmed kill. Given these poor efforts, in the end it was the emus that were victorious in the Great Emu War. It was only after the government introduced bounties on the emus in 1934 that the mass culling was effective. Today, emus are protected under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999.
The Great Plague of London, 1665 to 1666. In the spring of 1665, an epidemic of the bubonic plague emerged in London, England. The plague began in the parish of St Giles in the Fields, a poor area outside of London's walls, and as spring turned to a hot summer, it became an epidemic. The second plague pandemic is speculated to have started in China and spread through Europe through trade. The bubonic plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which is transmitted by fleas that live on rats. Victims would have symptoms including fever, coughing up blood, and painful buboes, blisters and bruises on the body. Victims typically died within days of catching the illness. The poorest areas were the most unsanitary, with rubbish and waste littering the streets, and were therefore the hardest hit by the plague. Doctors were also too expensive for most people, although their treatment was limited in its effectiveness because they thought miasmas, or bad air, was the cause of the plague. The rich, meanwhile, as they could afford to, fled the city. King Charles II, the nobility, parliament and most merchants, lawyers and doctors fled, while the poor remained. The Lord Mayor and aldermen also remained, to keep order and stop the disease spreading further. In June, the Mayor closed the gates of London to people without a certificate of health, as the roads were bottlenecked from people trying to escape the city. By autumn, 7,000 people were dying from the plague every week in the city. Watchmen were employed to enforce a quarantine. If a person was infected or had died of the plague, their whole family would be locked away with them in their house, sealed from the outside and kept guard over. A red cross was then painted on the door to distinguish it. Soon enough, the whole family would be infected and would suffer the same way. A common sight was also drivers of dead cars with piles of bodies who moved around the streets calling, "Bring out your dead!" and the dead would be buried in mass graves. As winter came, the spread of disease was slowed down. From December 1665, people started to return to London, and by February 1666, the death toll had decreased to a level that was safe for the king to return. It is estimated that up to 100,000 people died in London from the Great Plague. After the Great Plague, the Great Fire of London would again engulf the city in disaster, but it may also have helped kill off some of the rats and fleas carrying the plague.
Unbelievable plague cures. The Middle Ages. The Black Death. The bubonic plague, more commonly known as the Black Death, due to the black buboes that would swell in the armpits and groins of victims, decimated the population of Europe during the Middle Ages, from 1347 to 1351. These buboes would swell, sometimes as large as an egg, and turn black before eventually rupturing, oozing blood and pus, putting the person in agony. Other symptoms of the plague included fever, rashes, difficulty breathing, and vomiting blood. We associate the name the Black Death with this initial devastating outbreak, but in reality the bubonic plague continued to affect and devastate Europe for the next few centuries. During the outbreak, the plague spread rapidly from the Middle East across continental Europe and then jumped the channel to the British Isles. As terror and disease ran rampant throughout Europe, people searched for answers. Some believed that God was punishing the human race for their sins through divine intervention or in the form of the disease. One of the most prominent theories was delivered to the King of France by a respected medical institution in France. They said that the cause of the plague was the conjunction of 3 planets in 1345, which then caused a great pestilence in the air. This was followed by the bad air theory or miasma theory, which became widely accepted everywhere. However, the Black Death was actually caused by bites from the fleas carried on rats. Due to the high death toll, streets were often littered with bodies that were left outside for the death collectors, as they were to be taken away and buried in mass graves known as plague pits. Life had become so tragic that, as one Italian citizen in 1348, Agnolo di Tura, stated, "There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death. And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world." As the death toll increased and people continued to be struck down by the disease throughout Europe, and entire families were being wiped out, plague doctors began to get desperate and creative with so-called plague cures. These are some of those cures. Bloodletting. One way physicians and plague doctors attempted to cure the Black Death was through bloodletting. Bloodletting was common during the Middle Ages, as it was believed that it expelled harmful humors from within the body that were causing the sickness. The practice of bloodletting involved leeching or cutting near to the site of the infection, in this case, the bubo. However, cutting into the skin to drain the blood often led to further infection, as the immune system was already weak and health conditions were unsanitary given the circumstances. Plague doctors would also sometimes lance the buboes, releasing a putrid odor along with blood and pus. Sweating. Sweating was also a popular cure. In this case, the doctor would provide the patient with medicine that would raise their temperature. The idea was to make the patient sweat out the corruption from the blood that the disease caused. It was seen as a last resort treatment. Treacle. One of the more pleasant ways of curing the plague was to use treacle, a type of syrup made of unrefined sugar. The catch was that the treacle had to be aged for at least 10 years to be an effective cure for the Black Death. The reasoning behind this cure was that the substance, which by that point would be horrific smelling and very sticky,
was going to rid the body of the disease while simultaneously counteracting the effects of the disease. The treacle was drank in its thick, syrupy form and was thought to completely rid the plague from the victim's body. While seemingly improbable, it is possible that over the course of the 10-year aging period that disease-fighting molds may have developed within the treacle that could help fight off the plague. Whether this saved anyone is largely unknown. Bathe in urine. Whilst we might find this a disgusting cure by today's clean standards, this isn't altogether unsurprising. Urine was believed to have healing properties and had been associated with medical issues since the days of Galen and Hippocrates. Urine was often examined in flasks by physicians who matched the color and consistency to illustrations. Victims of the plague were given urine to bathe in, with the thought being that it would relieve their symptoms. This was then taken further, and some victims were given urine to drink. Crushed emeralds. Unsurprisingly, this cure was more for the wealthy plague sufferer. The idea was that swallowing the precious stones would help to restore balance amongst the humors, and therefore cure the victim. Emeralds weren't the only precious jewels used. Other minerals such as pearls were said to be effective. The stones were usually ground down and mixed with water to form a sparkly potation, one that was laced with little bits of emerald that probably felt like broken glass. Covering yourself in human excrement. Doctors would make a paste from human feces, flower roots, and some tree resins. The buboes would then be cut open and the paste would be smeared on. The open wound would then be tightly wrapped to keep the paste inside. Live in a sewer. On the face of it, this is a very counterproductive cure. However, medieval doctors thought that the plague was caused by the air. It was thought that the disgusting smells of the sewer would stop the less smelly but disease-ridden air from coming near them, and therefore infecting them. Sadly, not only was it a disgusting cure, it also wasn't very effective, as it often exposed victims to a variety of other nasty diseases. Whipping yourself. The Middle Ages were a particularly religious time, and it's no wonder that people turned to God when they got the disease. They thought that it might be God's punishment for being sinful, and that the only way to a cure was to punish themselves. They did this through flagellation. This was where they went into the streets and whipped themselves and each other to punish themselves for their sins in the hope that God would cure them. Dinner parties. Some doctors thought that stress made people more susceptible to the plague, so they recommended eating their meals with others in order to promote merrymaking and reduce stress. In Florence, Marchione di Capostefani describes how people used to take turns to host the dinners, although often 2 or 3 people wouldn't turn up. This cure helped to spread the plague more because of close contact with the infected. The live chicken cure. This may be the most puzzling of the plague cures. During the medieval period into the 18th century, a popular cure was the live chicken cure, or the Vickery method. The live chicken treatment included taking a rooster, plucking its backside, and placing its rump onto the buboes of the plague victim. Supposedly, the bare chicken would draw out the poison in the buboes, therefore curing the plague victim of the terrible disease. The live chicken treatment was so popular throughout Europe that it was integrated into normal medical procedures for the plague victims by the 16th century. Some physicians believed that the heat from the chicken was what drew the poison from the buboes, while others simply believed the chicken balanced the humors within the body. Quarantine. The most tried and true of the cures was the use of quarantine, which had begun to be implemented in Italy in 1348. Quarantine policies required that individuals, even entire families, be confined to or shut up in their homes until they had recovered from the plague, and then be confined for a further 40 days afterwards. For many, that recovery never happened. Bodies littered the streets in front of the isolated houses. For when a family member died in quarantine, they would be left on the doorstep to be taken away to the plague pits. While plague quarantine policies did work in some ways, the death toll in London was still high at around 10,400 people, 7.5% of the city's population in 1636. Of course, these cures were not very successful, and eventually the Black Death just went away. Later, it would return time and time again across the next few centuries. As time went on and medicine became more refined, doctors began to understand what remedies worked and why. Sanitation and quarantine became more and more important as cures, while others, such as flagellation, became less prominent. You might wonder why these cures were ever tried and if people really believe them to work. The answer is yes. Physicians and patients really believed that these cures were the right thing to do in stopping the plague. It is likely that the cures became widespread because someone tried them and it appeared to work. Word would spread and more people would try them. That means there were probably more crazy cures that were out there that we don't know about. The plague that made people dance until they died. Medieval Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries. Europe during the Middle Ages was a time of great hardships. Nearly endless wars led to frequent famines. As the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously said, life, particularly for the peasantry, was unusually nasty, brutish, and short. One of the peculiar ways in which it appears the peasantry of the Middle Ages dealt with these hardships was through a bizarre phenomenon known as choreomania. The term is derived from the Greek words choros, meaning to dance, and mania, meaning madness or compulsion. Historical records from the 14th to the 17th century documents periods of dancing mania so frequently that they can't be dismissed as mere rumor or exaggeration. Outbreaks of this so-called dancing mania involve groups of people dancing erratically and uncontrollably, sometimes in their hundreds or even thousands. Like a disease, the mania would spread from town to town and even country to country as if it were contagious. Historical records are sometimes very detailed about these outbreaks, which affected men, women, and children, dancing often until they collapsed from exhaustion or injuries. The first sparsely recorded outbreak of dancing mania is actually from the 11th century, where on Christmas Eve in 1021, people are said to have danced en masse in the German town of Kulbeck. A couple hundred years later in Erfurt, another incident was recorded, and around the same time in Maastricht, it was said that 200 people fell to their death while dancing on a bridge that collapsed under their weight. However, the first well-documented outbreak of dancing mania was in 1374 in the German town of Aachen. For reasons that are unclear, the people of Aachen started to dance involuntarily. They moved frantically until near the point of total exhaustion. Within weeks, this strange compulsion has spread like the plague to the Netherlands and northeast of France. Hundreds of people uncontrollably jumped, leapt, and twitched for days. Another well-documented outbreak happened 150 years later in France. There was a woman called Frau Trophea who started dancing in the city of Strasbourg in July of 1518 for weeks on end. She was gradually joined by more and more people, and the situation escalated when the city authorities provided a stage and hired musicians in hope of bringing the bizarre crisis to an end. Once the first dancers started their strange ritual, however, others joined in, claiming to be overwhelmed by a compulsion. A manuscript in the city's archive of the time offers a glimpse of the scale of the epidemic that followed. It reads, "There has been a strange epidemic lately going amongst the folk, so that many in their madness began dancing, which they kept up day and night without interruption until they fell unconscious. Many have died of it." While seemingly improbable, dozens of medieval sources from different towns mention both the 1374 and the 1518 incidents. The latter was even mentioned in the city of Strasbourg's municipal orders, and it is clear from these records that during both incidents, the people afflicted by this dancing mania were not simply shaking from some unknown plague, but actually dancing, albeit involuntarily. They were obviously in great physical and mental pain as well.
The records detail that most of those with dancing mania also had horrible hallucinations and could be heard praying for absolution in the middle of their dancing fits. Often they barely ate or slept, and sometimes they were not even fully conscious of their actions. The theories of what actually happened to cause these epidemics varied across the centuries. Some blamed religious beliefs and demonic possession. Others suggested the existence of a dancing cult, while others blamed them on mass poisonings which caused hallucinations and shaking. One of the most bizarre and yet widespread contemporary explanations was that the dancing mania was brought on by a curse from St. John the Baptist, or in other places, St. Vitus. Why or how either of these dead saints could have made such a curse is unclear, but so common was the belief that in many places the dancing mania was actually named after them, as in St. John's Dance or St. Vitus's Dance. In Italy, the dancing mania was sometimes called tarantism, and it was believed to be brought on by either a spider bite or a dangerous poison. Later on, as medical science evolved, a similar condition to dancing mania was labeled Sydenham chorea, but this disorder was thought to only affect children, causing them to have involuntary tremors in the arms, legs, and face. In 1888, a German gentleman named Justus Friedrich Karl Hecke wrote a fairly comprehensive account of the dancing mania phenomenon entitled The Black Death and the Dancing Mania. In it, he imaginatively describes what he calls St. John's Dance as follows. They formed circles hand in hand and, appearing to have lost all control over their senses, continued dancing, regardless of the bystanders, for hours together in wild delirium, until at length they fell to the ground in a state of exhaustion. They then complained of extreme oppression and groaned, which they again recovered and remained free from complaint until the next attack. Modern researchers believe the outbreaks were most likely examples of mass psychogenic illness triggered by fear and depression. Both of the most well-documented manias of 1374 and 1518 were preceded by particularly bad periods of devastating famine, crop failures, and disease. Anxiety and fear, combined with a religious belief that such hardships were the result of God punishing them for their wrongdoing, made people, according to this theory, susceptible to mass delusions that may have gave them some reprieve from their dire situations. Ultimately, this too is just an educated guess. What is for sure, however, is that diagnosing a mass contagion from 500 years ago is not easy. We will probably never know what exactly caused the dancing mania of the Middle Ages, but the urge to dance away one's troubles isn't all that strange if you think about it. Swine and punishment. The pigs tried for murder in medieval France, 1200 to 1750. Over 500 years ago, the small French village of Savigny was rocked by a horrific tragedy. Unaware of the coming danger, a 5-year-old boy happily played alone in the street. But then, out of nowhere, a group of attackers accosted the young child, tearing off his head and arms without hesitation. It was broad daylight, and the bold killers made no attempt to conceal their crime. It sounds like something out of a TV detective drama, except for one striking feature. The perpetrators were pigs. Specifically, the ringleader was a sow, accompanied by her 6 piglets. The villagers were naturally appalled by the horrible event, but it didn't end there. All 7 pigs were arrested and put through a criminal trial as if they were human beings. Although the pig's owner was initially arrested too, the judge ruled that he was not liable for the pig's action. That left just the pigs to be indicted for murder. They were kept in prison while awaiting trial. After all, the village didn't want a murderous gang on the loose. The entire process played out exactly how it would have in a human trial, with attorneys arguing for the defense and prosecution. The piglets got off lightly due to their age and lack of evidence proving they were active participants in the crime. However, because their original owner was not willing to guarantee their future good behavior, they were forfeited to Catherine du Barneau, Lady of Savigny. As for their mother, the case was pretty open and shut, with over 9 witnesses testifying against her. Their evidence was only compounded by the sow's disrespectful behavior in court. Unapologetically, she grunted, squealed, and tried to poke her nose through the bars in the prisoner's box.
There were no mitigating circumstances that would have softened her punishment. After spending nearly a month in jail, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. Within days, she was publicly hanged from a tree by her hind legs alongside other condemned criminals. While this may seem like a bizarre occurrence, animal trials were fairly common in medieval and early modern France. Between the 10th and 18th centuries, over 100 animal trials took place. Sometimes a swarm of locusts would be tried for trespassing and the destruction of crops. Other times, a horse would be charged for sodomy. Overwhelmingly, though, it was pigs being tried for murder. This raises a couple of questions. Firstly, why were pigs so bloodthirsty? During the Middle Ages, it was normal to see pigs roaming free in the streets. In these rural communities, parents felt comfortable allowing their children to explore outside unattended. Unlike the large cities of today, people knew and trusted their neighbors, and there were no modern dangers such as cars to watch out for. That didn't make it entirely safe, though. As the pig trials show, danger was never as far away as it seemed. There were situations where small children would come into contact with pigs, and sometimes those pigs had a taste for human flesh. Of course, even large pigs couldn't take on fully grown adults, so their victims were usually very young. Take another infamous sow who sparked public outrage in 1567 when she snacked on a 4-month-old girl sleeping in her cot. So that's how it happened. But why did the courts even bother putting pigs through formal trials? Well, historians disagree on the reason. One popular theory is that this was how folk communities restored order after an unsettling event occurred. By reframing the unforeseeable accident as the decision of a rational actor, they could understand the tragedy and create a sense of justice. Others speculate that these public trials and executions were meant to serve as a warning to parents that they shouldn't leave their children unattended. Just like human offenders, criminal pigs were paraded around the streets in carts on the way to their executions. They were sometimes dressed in human clothes and were hanged in front of an audience. In case anybody missed the live event, they could still see the pig's corpse swaying in the wind for days after the execution. It certainly sent a message. Some scholars dismiss those theories as absurd, however, emphasizing how bizarre and cruel the whole process was. They see it as making a parody of the law, an example of humans extending their authority to every aspect of life on Earth by brute force. No matter the explanation, animal trials spread to nearby parts of Italy, Switzerland, and the Low Countries from the 15th century. But by the 18th century, animal trials were on the decline. During the Enlightenment, there was a revival in Roman law across Europe, which held that animals were not rational and so couldn't be tried for crimes. Over time, European legal systems came to resemble our modern courts, where only humans, not pigs, could be tried for murder.